Hello and welcome to lecture 26. Finally, we can jump into the art of lighting. So I will be starting with studio light setups, a typical photo studio, and what we can do, how it works, and how bounce light works, how to use fill and key lights and all that magic. So let's get right into it and jump over to my Maya scene where I have prepared a little backdrop and a asset, which is my main character. So let's jump to the perspective view, and now you can see I have a little plane which is bent in the corner here, so it's a soft gradient fall off in the background. It has a very basic shader. It's got a 70% gray base color. Specular is completely off, so it's fully diffuse. And then we have our main character, which is 170 centimeters in height. We have a render camera, which has an 80 millimeter focal length. And that is our current setup. So you might wonder, what is a studio setup? And if you would just type in or search for Google a typical studio lighting, this is what you get. And this is more or less what I want to show you in this lecture. It starts off really basic, and we then go in the next lectures, we go into a bit more detail. What is a 3-point light setup and other very interesting techniques. So at first, what I want to explain you is how it really works, why they have backdrops, why they have these area lights, why they have these point lights, and all the fancy stuff of lighting. So let's go to the Arnold menu, go to lights, and create an area light. So it is in the origin. Let's scale this bad boy up, and let's try to make it kind of realistic. And if you check some of those images again, you can see how large they actually are. Like, you can see the humans standing here. So they are about maybe a meter in width and height. So let's just kind of try to get the same size going for us. So if I select the light and go to my scale, and let's put 100 units, which is 1 meter in my scene scale. And then let's just face it towards the backdrop, maybe behind the character, maybe a bit up high, and rotate it towards the backdrop. And just increase the exposure. Let's go with 5, and you can see not much going on. Let's try 10. Slightly something, 15, and now you can see we slowly get some light into our render. So if I slowly bring in more exposure, you can see on the left how we expose our image. And due to the fact that it's not fully behind the character, we get some rim lighting on him. So what we want to do now is we want to change the angle. And in the previous lecture about area lights, I was explaining you what the spread parameter does. So let's just go down maybe a 0.5 spread, so it's more angled. And actually, let's just reduce the scale of the light maybe by half. So it's 50 centimeters in width and height. And we can put it a bit closer towards the backdrop. You can see if I move it closer, we get a whiter background. And currently we are lighting right behind the character, somewhere around here. So let's just rotate it a bit, angle it maybe down like that. And let's make actually the spread a bit smaller still. So you can see the higher the spread, the more it reaches the arms of the character. So let's make it pretty small so it goes right past him. Something like this is interesting. So now you can see just by doing that, we are lighting up the backdrop, and because of that, we get everywhere on the character, we get these nice soft fall-offs everywhere. So it looks very natural, and it's kind of like a soft feeling to everything. So this is the idea of placing a light behind or next to the characters, lighting the backdrop. You can play around with the intensity to get some interesting gradients on the backdrop as well. So if this is something you want to do, create a more interesting backdrop, play around. You can play around with colors and all that. And the next step would be to create a light which is most of the time in front of the camera, to the side of the camera, to create some nice lighting angles. So let's create another light, area light. scale it up, and let's just move it back. Oops, that was the wrong handle. Let's just move it back above the camera so it's kind of front lit, and let's just boost up the exposure to 15 maybe. And you can see now we get some front facing light, which is not that appealing because it's very flat. It's not really looking great. It's not adding to the light setup. So what I like to do, it's my personal preference, is just to have a light which is more side lit, like this. So you always get this nice directional light to the character or to your asset or whatever, which is just a bit more appealing. And what you can also do is change the spread. Currently it's 180 degrees, so we want to make it maybe 0.5, so it's not as spreading as much. And we can then reduce the exposure a bit. Something like that is, I think, more appealing. We can try to place it a bit more to placing it a bit more to the side. You get a nicer angle, and maybe also tilt it down towards the character so we get a nice directional light to him. Maybe a bit less. Alright, so this would be now a 2 light setup. So one is kind of right from the camera, and it's actually pretty similar to this reference image here, where we have the characters in the middle. We have one light from the top right, and then we have a fill which lights up the backdrop in the background. So this is kind of what we have set up right here. And another cool thing, because currently these are the only 2 lights and the backdrop which produce our image, you can see in the chrome sphere what's actually being rendered. So what I like to do as well, it's up to you what look you want to create, but let's just create another area light and move this one up so it's kind of a top down light, which gives us a bit more harder shadows in the face area. So let's just angle it down and also bring up the exposure to maybe 15 and just scrub it so it gets brighter. And now by adding the top light, you can see what we get. We get some nice highlights on the head, on top of the arms. And if we scale it down, we get some harsher shadows. And this is now more apparent in the face because you can see there is some directionality to the whole thing. You can see shadows in the eyes, around the arms. And if I move it back behind the character, you can see they angle more forwards, and you can see there is more shadows in the front. If it's more front to the front, you can see it's more on the nose, and the shadows retract a bit. So this is all placement of the lights to make your object more interesting. And this is kind of a typical setup for a studio where you can play around with lots of different things. Another thing to know is in the parameters of the light, you can make them a bit softer in the fall off. You can see that now it's a bit hard to see, but if I add a soft edge, you get a fall off in the lights. So from really crunchy to a softer fall off, and this does help a lot, especially if you have shiny objects like cars or some other objects which are reflective. This would help a lot in realism. So I just tend to do that actually. And you can also make them a bit rounder, so it's not these really crisp and hard edges. So it's all about breaking up your renders a bit. And then another cool thing, because it's digital, it's super easy to color correct or just add colors to your lights. So let's say we want to have a top-down red light, a top-down blue light. What you can do is use Kelvin temperature and just increase the temperature until you're satisfied with the result. So this is now a blue top-down light. And we can also make maybe a warm color temperature for the right side. And then for the backdrop, maybe we can do something crazy and just color it maybe some kind of green. So this is all up to you, whatever you want to do. And by just changing the light color to green, you can see that there's like a soft bounce on his cheek and on his shoulders, where you can see there is this green light bouncing back off him. And just a thing to understand is this only works if you have diffuse bounces. So if you don't have that, or if it's maybe on one, you will not see as much bounce as you would expect. And if it's off, you definitely don't get this nice bounce effect. So this is very important to have at least a value of 1 and ideally maybe a value of 3 to get most of the bounce which you have in the lights. So this sums up lecture 26 about studio lighting, how to set up your scene, use a backdrop, and just add a few lights to play around. Try to use area lights. You can use round lights as well to create interesting effects. But all in all, a studio setup will look like this. And then you can play around with different techniques. You can search for typical lighting techniques. There are lots of different ways to make something look a lot more interesting. So this was the introduction and the basic setups for a studio scene, and in the next lecture we will talk about a bit more in detail about 3-point light setups and maybe something else, we will see. So I'm eager to see you in the next lecture.